Hi Historians, and welcome to A Historian Reacts to Season 2 of The Crown. If you are looking for a quick rundown, 10 things that The Crown got wrong about the royal family, this is not the video for you. We are going to do a really deep dive, go episode by episode, and look at everything that happened in that episode, and we are going to verify what's true and debunk the things that are false. Before we get started, I just have to say a few very quick thank yous to my lovely commenters, new subscribers, and the lovely people that have sent me messages. So I would like to thank CL, Anastasia Kirby, and Kailuki, I think that's right. I'll put your names here for the lovely comments that you've left on my videos. I would like to thank my new subscribers, Jalen Towner, James Snare, and Lavender Lil 555. Thank you very much for subscribing. If you have subscribed and your subscriptions are set to private, I cannot see when you have subscribed to my channel, so please hit that subscribe button right now. Thank you. And leave me a comment below to say you have subscribed, and I will shout you out in my next video and say thank you very much, because your subscribing really does mean the world to me. I also want to thank Daya Mukherjee, I really hope I've said your name properly, and Sarah Merlo for your really sweet messages on Instagram, particularly Daya or Dia. Your message really lit up my morning, so thank you so much for that. Without further ado, let's get on with Season 2 of The Crown. Disclaimer, just before I start as well, I will be referring to Elizabeth as Liz throughout this video. As I said in my last video, it is not a sign of disrespect, it's actually a term of endearment that we call her here in the UK. Our Liz, our Queen Liz, so I will be calling her Liz for brevity's sake mostly, but also because it's a term of endearment. Let's get into episode 1, Misadventure. Setúbal Harbour, Lisbon, 1957, 16th of February. Rumours and the press gather around Elizabeth and Philip's marital problems. They discuss the possibility of divorce, which would never happen, of course, due to the church and the Queen Mother's views on it, but they discuss it nonetheless. Elizabeth was absolutely devoted to Philip as well. Flashback to the day Philip left, and we have tensions, and there certainly were tensions, which weren't helped by Philip taking off on a 4-month tour aboard the HMS Britannia without Liz and the kids in October 1956. After they'd returned from the Commonwealth tour, after they'd had the argument in Australia that we discussed in the last episode of Season 1, rumours were certainly rife. Over to Egypt, and Nasser stages a coup and takes the Suez Canal. Philip's Thursday Lunch Club makes an appearance. This was a real thing. No one knows what happened behind closed doors. It was likely a lot less debauched than is shown in the series. Mistresses? There were rumours that Philip was involved with other women whilst aboard Britannia, including a dancer called Pat Kirkwood, to which the palace issued a public denial. There's no direct evidence of an affair. There's never any pictures of Philip doing inappropriate things or caught in inappropriate moments. There's no concrete, solid proof, just to put that out there before we begin. Just hearsay and speculation. While sneaking a gift into Philip's briefcase before his departure, Liz finds a photograph of a stunning ballerina, Galina Ulanova. There's absolutely no evidence of a real-life affair there. Ulanova was a real Russian ballerina who performed in London in 1956 at the Royal Opera House. The press fawned over her, but she was 46, 16 years older than Liz at the time, and Galena seems to have preferred the company of women. Honestly, she had a reputation for being aloof and private, and later in life ended up with a female companion who guarded her and served her needs. So I think the chances of that affair are slim. Pat Kirkwood, however, may have some truth to her rumour. Her and Philip met in 1948 when he was introduced to her in a dressing room at the Hippodrome Theatre where she was headlining. The two were said to have dined alone in public before dancing till dawn at a London nightclub while Elizabeth was 8 months pregnant with Charles. They met up a further 6 times and shared letters that have been given to a writer with the instructions to show them to no one except the Duke's official biographer when one is appointed after his death. Well, that hits different. When I wrote these notes, His Royal Highness was still with us. So we'll see on that one. Pat Kirkwood always vehemently denied an affair and hated the press speculation, telling a journalist, "A lady is not normally expected to defend her honour. It is the gentleman who should do that. I would have had a happier and easier life if Prince Philip, instead of coming uninvited to my dressing room, had gone home to his pregnant wife on the night in question." Fair comment, though. Fair comment. Royal biographer Sarah Bedford claims Philip did have affairs, but not with high-profile women like actresses, preferring young aristocrats. The Duchess of Abercorn conceded she had shared a passionate friendship with Philip, but one that did not extend to the bedroom, saying, "It's complicated, but at the same time quite simple. He needs a playmate and someone to share his intellectual pursuits." He was also linked to Helena Corday, novelist Daphne du Maurier, Princess Alexandria, Elizabeth's cousin. Former Palace Press Secretary Dickie Arbiter said, "He's always liked window shopping, but he doesn't buy." When asked by a female journalist about possible infidelity, Philip himself quipped, "Good God, woman, have you ever stopped to think that for years I have never moved anywhere without a policeman accompanying me? So how the hell could I get away with anything like that?" Also a fair point, but we know people tend to look the other way. Anyway, there's no solid, concrete, direct proof. As I said, there's no photographs, there's no letters that have been published, nothing like that I can find. And I doubt there will be while Her Majesty is still with us. That said, I believe, allegedly, that Philip did have a bit of a wandering eye and perhaps occasionally might have acted on it. But he was certainly not stupid about it. I'll say that. Israeli, British and French forces move into Egypt, beginning with airstrikes to try and win back the Suez Canal from Nasser, and Liz watches Ulanova perform and declines her invitation to meet her. Unlikely to have been done because Philip fancied her, as I said. Ulanova preferred the company of women, so we can safely rule that affair out, at least. And we're on to episode 2, A Company of Men. What happens with Philip on tour of Britannia stays on tour. Private Secretary Mike Parker is leading him astray and being a terrible husband to his wife, Eileen. Parker writes to the Thursday Lunch Club that it's like a 5-month stag do, whores in every port. Charming fellow. Riots against Eden spring up and military intervention in Egypt breaks out. Humiliation, retreat and ceasefire is the way it goes. Britain loses the Suez Canal, panic buying ensues, and food rationing is brought back in. We have to bear in mind that the Suez Canal was the UK's trade route from the east, from India. So, much like Brexit, it was going to cause disruption. In the last episode, we talked about how Anthony Eden, the Prime Minister, was on medication called Purple Hearts for a gallbladder surgery he had that had gone wrong. And those Purple Hearts, which are now banned, they were banned in the 70s, could cause hallucinations, paranoia, fixation, all kinds of things like that. And it's quite possible that Eden got so completely hung up on NASA and the Suez Canal, and it led him to make the mistakes that he made. But that's pure speculation on my part. Suez Crisis, it was a really, really embarrassing defeat, and it marked the beginning of the end for Eden as Prime Minister. Helen King, a journalist, shows an interest in Philip. Helen King is not based on a real person as far as I can tell. She's just a plot device that allows us to then probe into Philip's childhood, which we'll get into later. Eden steps down temporarily due to ill health and he legs it to Jamaica. Mike Parker's wife, Eileen, wants a divorce but needs evidence of adultery. A waitress at the lunch club comes forward and confirms it and finally hands over those incriminating letters from Mike to Eileen as proof. Eileen did indeed file for divorce while Mike was away aboard the Britannia, though there's no evidence for the lunch club note being sent by Parker at all, let alone a waitress getting it and then giving it to Eileen. Both Elizabeth and Philip give Christmas speeches for the first time in 1956 separately. Philip gets homesick and sends Liz some tour footage. Eileen Parker and Mike Parker was quite a scandal at the time. This is Prince Philip's private secretary. Divorce is a no-no. And he is being divorced by his wife for being unfaithful. That is going to cause rumour as to what Prince Philip is getting up to, and it certainly did. Now we're on to episode 3, Lisbon. Prime Minister Eden returns after 3 weeks in Jamaica, after which he is pushed out of his cabinet and resigns to Liz on the grounds of ill health. Harold Macmillan then comes and takes over as Prime Minister. The Suez Canal, as I said before, was curtains for Eden. There was absolutely no recovering from that. Liz finds out about the Parker divorce, which makes headlines, and Philip forces Parker to resign as his private secretary to avoid being tainted by the scandal. That happened. Mike Parker did resign. Parker leaves the ship at Gibraltar. In 1957, a divorce was still a major scandal and did generate massive publicity and press interest. Rather than Philip demanding his resignation, Parker fell on his sword and did it himself. 2 weeks later, Liz and Philip are reunited in Portugal on a stormy night where they spend 20 hours together sequestered on board after their 5-month separation. On the 22nd of February 1957, 6 days after the reconciliation, Philip is given the title Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Rather than any insecurities on Philip's part about titles, as we see in the series, this title is actually probably given to him so that he is exempt from giving evidence in the Parker divorce trial. But that's not as exciting for TV. As we saw in the last season, Philip only really cared about his children's surnames. He didn't really care about his own titles, so I think the motivation there might have been to exempt him from having to give evidence. Eileen Parker was eventually granted a divorce in 1958 on the grounds of adultery. The other woman's name was cited as Mrs. Mary Alexandra Thompson. Custody of the children, Michael 13 and Julie 9, was awarded to Eileen. Parker moved back to Australia in the late 1960s, despite stepping on a plane there at the end of the episode. And he stayed friends with Philip, exchanging regular letters and even visiting Buckingham Palace on occasion. Episode 4. Beryl. As a Russian satellite orbits the Earth, it's Margaret's birthday. And after an accidental proposal from Billy Wallace, they're due to announce their engagement that evening. However, Billy is a no-show, as he's been shot in the leg during a duel with Margaret's friend Colin Tennant. When confronted by Margaret, Billy admits Colin was outraged by Billy's behaviour, including being unfaithful to Margaret. Margaret immediately calls the whole thing off, saying, "People like you don't get to insult people like me." Billy and Margaret were engaged only a few months after she broke it off with Peter Townsend. This was probably a rebound thing, in part because she thought it best to marry somebody one at least liked. Billy was an old friend of hers. Their engagement didn't end with a drunken duel, but with a brief affair he had on a trip to the Bahamas a year before Margaret even met her future husband, Tony Armstrong-Jones. It's Liz and Philip's 10-year anniversary dinner. Margaret walks out in tears, smashes up her room in a tantrum, drunk and stumbling and crying. Didn't happen. Because Margaret never actually attended their 10-year anniversary dinner in 1957 at all. Harold Macmillan's wife is in love with another man, Bobby Boothby, who is their daughter Sarah's biological father. Lady Dorothy did have a 30-year affair with Bobby Boothby, which was an open secret, the affair ending with Dorothy's death in 1966. Harold Macmillan knew he wasn't Sarah's father, but treated her with love and kindness regardless. He was well aware of the affair and had come to accept it, but wouldn't divorce her due to the social stigma. By his own recollections, Boothby was not quite as keen as Dorothy and tried to break it off on multiple occasions, but Dorothy's jealousy, selfishness and possessiveness made it impossible. Harold and Bobby were both Tory MPs, and Boothby was later ennobled as Baron Boothby of Buchan and Rattray Head, or Buchan and Rattray Head. I'll write it down here. Margaret goes to a party with normal people at her lady-in-waiting's house where she meets photographer Tony Armstrong-Jones. He nicknames her Beryl while taking her photo at his studio and then drives her home on his motorbike. The racy photo of her taken by him is posted in the Times newspaper sent in by Margaret as an act of rebellion. In fact, Tony had been taking pictures of the royal family in the gardens of Buckingham Palace in 1957, and that's how him and Margaret met. They began spending time together in the spring of 58. The photo that was sent to the Times wasn't actually taken until 1967, long after they were married, but Tony did ride a motorbike and he had his own studio. And Margaret did like to pose for rebellious pictures. Now, when I say rebellious, I don't mean raunchy or anything like that. But if you look at the traditional royal portrait, definitely you can see after the breakup with Peter Townsend, Margaret's image and her photos, you can see the rebellion. You can see the rebound. Her photos have heartbroken and rebelling written all over them. I'll put some in here, some that I think are the coolest. Margaret was a badass. We stan. Episode 5, Marionettes. We're introduced to Lord Altrincham. Lord Altrincham gets punched, for those of you that are not in the UK, gets decked and spat at for writing a story in the paper about the Queen being priggish as he's leaving a TV studio after filming Impact. His comments sparked by the Queen's speech at the Jaguar car factory, where she talks about monotonous, average, dull and dreary people being essential to society. The man who struck Altrincham is a member of the League of Empire Loyalists, an extreme right-wing group that's pro-empire and pro-racist, and this turns the tide back to Altrincham's favour. He and Liz meet and he suggests stopping the debutantes' ball, allowing divorced people to move more freely in royal circles, getting rid of old school courtiers, lowering the drawbridge and letting people get to know her by televising the Christmas speech, plus spending time with normal people instead of just the rich. Truth. Second Baron Altrincham had been criticising the monarchy since the coronation in 1953, but no one had paid him much attention. By 1957, the national mood had shifted a little bit, especially after the Suez Crisis. In 1957, he wrote a piece in his magazine, the National and English Review, saying courtiers were too removed from the common citizens and called Liz a pain in the neck and a priggish schoolgirl, so he did call her priggish. Pathé News covered the article and the resulting slap in the face delivered by Philip Burbage, who was fined £1 for the assault. It's important to note that Altrincham was not a Republican. He was really actually interested in helping the monarchy to be more current and in touch. He had a mixed reception. The BBC banned him. The Duke of Argyll said he should be hung, drawn and quartered, but others agreed with him. As Altrincham left Impact at ITV Studios, 64-year-old ex-soldier Philip Burbage jumped out and slapped him outside court. After receiving his £1 fine, he said, "I did what Prince Philip wanted to do but couldn't." Questionable. There was no official meeting between Altrincham and Liz, but Martin Charteris did speak with him. Regardless of whether he and Liz actually met, she did take his comments to heart, making her first televised Christmas speech that same year. And in 1958, the traditional presentation party debutante ball for young upper-class people at court were replaced with a more relaxed garden party, which were more accessible to a broader range of people. Normal people were also invited to Buckingham Palace. Almost all of Altrincham's proposed changes to the monarchy were implemented. In 1963, Altrincham renounced his title and from then on was known by the name John Grigg. He turned his attention to his wife, Patricia, and 2 adopted sons, wrote a critically acclaimed biography of Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and passed away in 2001 at the age of 77. Decades later, Martin Charteris praised Greg for his article, saying, "You did a great service to the monarchy, and I'm glad to say so publicly." Episode 6, Vergangenheit. Just as a side note, this means past or history in German. Thuringia Forest, I think. Thuringia Forest, Germany, 1945, and Marburg Castle. Dug up tapes are sent back to the London Foreign Office, the Marburg Files, Volume 10. Back to the present, Billy Graham, an American TV evangelist and religious preacher, is becoming popular. Edward, the Duke of Windsor, is becoming disenfranchised with Wallis Simpson and all their parties, and she's fed up with him in return. He wants to go back to London to help serve his family and have a sense of duty, and to research for a book he's writing. The captured German War Documents Publication Unit Protected files are uncovered by an archivist who wants to hand them to the US to publish due to the seal injunction on British sets of papers. Billy Graham meets the Queen and gives a sermon and private audience at Windsor Chapel. This did happen back in 1955, and Liz and Billy Graham retained a good relationship and continued to write to each other afterwards, which is nice. The Marburg files are shown to Macmillan, who passes them on to Liz. Edward is called to the Foreign Office to discuss potential diplomatic roles, just as Liz is reading these Marburg files. Liz confronts Edward about his relationships with high-ranking Nazis while he was in Lisbon, and is offered to pledge his support for peace with Germany in 1940, in direct opposition to Elizabeth's father and Edward's brother, George VI. The German government offered him a home in Spain to wait out the war. Edward says the Führer's desire for peace was in complete agreement with his own point of view. He was sent to the Bahamas because of his political views by George VI. Edward tells Liz it's all the fault of German propaganda and baseless rumours. The British public will never believe it. Liz wants to forgive him and move on, but Tommy Lascelles, Edward VIII's private secretary when he was king, as well as George VI's private secretary, and Philip disagree. They strongly advise against it. Lascelles divulges more than the Marburg files. Edward, as king, surrounded himself with renowned Nazi courtiers such as Karl, Duke of Saxe-Coburg. He also shared private Allied documents with Wallace, who was sleeping with German Ambassador Herr von Ribbentrop. The government stopped putting any sensitive documents in his red box, but he abdicated shortly after, and he and Wallace visited Hitler in Germany on an unofficial state visit. A plan was hatched at the home of Herr Hesse to reinstate Edward as king if and when the Germans won Europe. He visited SS training schools, and the Germans promised to provide troops to put down any colonial rebellions after dethroning George VI. He also visited very early prototype concentration camps. When a German plane crashed in Belgium carrying Hitler's entire military plan for the invasion of France, Edward told the Nazis that the Allies had recovered the documents, giving Germany time to change plans, and Paris fell to German occupation in less than a month. Edward told the German government that resolve against the Blitz aerial bombardment was weakening, and that continued bombing would soon make Britain ready for peace. Liz is totally crushed and denies Edward a political position, reminding him that he's only welcome in Britain at her invitation, and that permission has now been rescinded. The go-ahead is given for the Marburg files to be published. So you want to know the truth? The episode's title, Vergangenheit, refers to a 1937 film which was a piece of Nazi propaganda. Opfer der Vergangenheit, die Sünde wider Blut und Rasse, victims of the past, the sin against blood and race. Sorry if I butchered that. Which was shown in cinemas during World War II and was produced to build support for eugenics, particularly towards the elimination of people with mental illnesses and learning disabilities, as part of the Nazis' plan to build a German master race. We know Edward VIII and Wallace visited Germany in October of 1937 because there's pictures. They met with Hitler, visited SS training schools, etc., etc. According to Vanity Fair, the plan to reinstate Edward VIII as king was hatched 3 years after this visit, as opposed to being concocted on the trip. Historian Carolyn Harris maintains that Edward's visit to Hitler was for peaceful motives and to make Wallace feel more included in state affairs after the abdication. royal biographer Andrew Morton paints Edward as more of a Nazi sympathiser than a cunning schemer, trying to dethrone his brother, and that he was ignorant of the Nazis' true intentions. Hard to believe when he'd seen an early concentration camp, but what do I know? Just a historian. Edward was also quite anti-Semitic as well, so you decide. Edward was appointed governor of the Bahamas during the controversy surrounding his Nazi ties, and after that lived in France for the rest of his life. The royal family did not support Edward's visit to Germany. It was not an officially sanctioned visit. He was not on state business. Just after the war ended, 400 tons of German diplomatic papers were uncovered by the Americans at Marburg Castle, including a cache of documents damaging to the royal family called the Windsor File. There were around 60 documents, letters, telegrams, etc., written by people working around the Duke of Windsor during the war. Among these documents were details of Nazi plan Operation Willy, the plan for German invasion of Britain. They planned to overthrow the monarchy and elect the Duke of Windsor as a puppet head of state. German agents had tried to manipulate the ostracised Duke, attempting to convince him that his brother George VI wanted him assassinated. When World War II began, the Duke was made a Major General in France, but Churchill, aware of his pro-Nazi stance, sent him to be governor of the Bahamas, where they waited to see if Operation Willy would come to fruition. In 1946, Britain, France and the US agreed to work together to process the Marburg files. Despite British efforts to keep it under wraps, the US released the documents in 1957. Episode 7, Matrimonium. Brussels, Belgium, the 3rd of August, 1959. Townsend is waking up, mirrored by Margaret waking up in Buckingham Palace, to a letter from him to say he's marrying someone else. Tony doesn't want to marry Margaret and shags a dancer/model in his studio, as well as having a threesome with married couple the Frys. This causes him to reevaluate his decision. He proposes to Margaret at his studio and Margaret accepts. How romantic. The three-way relationship between Tony and Jeremy and Camilla Fry was substantiated in Andy Corsi's book Snowdon, the Biography. It's possible that Margaret wanted to get her engagement announcement in before Townsend's engagement announcement, but they're unable to announce it yet because Liz is expecting Andrew and no royal announcements are to be made until the baby is born. Tony is not only hiding his polio-twisted leg from Margaret, but has also gotten Camilla Fry pregnant. They did have a daughter, Polly Fry, but Polly didn't find out who her real father was until the age of 45, when in 2004 she persuaded Tony to take a DNA test. Tony had contracted polio at the age of 16 and he spent 6 months recuperating. He did walk with a limp for the rest of his life. Liz conducts inquiries and discovers that Tony is bisexual and he is involved in 3 other intimate relationships with Jackie Chan, a dancer, not that Jackie Chan, actress Gina Ward, and Robin Banks, a former assistant. The last one is not true. Robin was not interested in any way, shape or form. Gina and Jackie, that's true. The news sends Liz into labour and Prince Andrew is named after Philip's father. My question watching this was, what would Liz's birth experience have been like? Queen Elizabeth II was quite the trailblazer for royal birthing, being the first monarch in history to deliver a baby without the Home Secretary present. Yes, that was an actual requirement. She was also the first to have her husband present when the Prince Edward was born. Quick rundown of the Queen's birth experiences. Charles was born by C-section on the 14th of November 1948 in a room at Buckingham Palace, a guest room that they'd converted into a mini hospital. Liz was in labour for 30 hours and Philip was not present. He was playing squash with his private secretary to pass the time. He cradled the newly born Charles while still wearing his polo shirt, saying the new baby resembled a plum pudding, and giving Liz a bouquet of red roses and carnations. Anne was born on the 15th of August 1950 at 11:50 a.m, weighing 6 pounds at Clarence House. Philip was a very proud dad, declaring, "It's the sweetest girl," toasting her arrival with champagne with his staff, whilst the Queen Mother sat with mum and baby. Andrew was born on the 19th of February 1960 at 3:30 p.m, weighing 7 pounds 3 ounces in the Belgian suite at Buckingham Palace. In this birth, the Queen underwent a very controversial procedure called twilight sleep, which is no longer used, where a general anaesthetic of morphine and scopolamine was given and the baby was delivered via forceps, which we see in the series. Edward was born on the 10th of March 1964 at 8:20 p.m, weighing just 5 pounds 7 ounces. Philip was there for this one and was holding Liz's hand as Edward was born. The Queen was 37 and worried about her age. She'd read many articles that said the importance of involving fathers with the birth was paramount, and thus Philip became the first royal father in modern history to witness the arrival of one of his children. Surgeon gynecologist Sir John Peel led the team of doctors, midwives and nurses who assisted the delivery at Buckingham Palace. Margaret visits Liz, but Liz is unable to tell Margaret what she has discovered about Tony. Tony and Margaret marry on the 6th of May 1960 with 8 bridesmaids led by Princess Anne. She's given away by Philip and the wedding is televised. In real life, when they married, Margaret said she always suspected that Tony was a bit queer. Jeremy Fry had to step down as Tony's best man after the press discovered in 1952 that he'd been arrested for a minor homosexual offence. Couldn't find out what that was. If you can find out what that was, DM me on Instagram at the Herstory Girls, please and thank you. Episode 8, Dear Mrs. Kennedy. Accra, Ghana. African leaders meet to plan a new socialist Africa. Liz's portrait is taken down and Lenin's portrait is put up in her place. Khrushchev is in charge in Russia and Kennedy becomes president of the US. Liz starts to feel a bit inadequate compared to Jackie O when her and JFK visit Buckingham Palace. There's no way of knowing how she felt. Jackie and JFK get the protocol all wrong. They use the wrong titles. Jackie doesn't curtsy. And Jackie pays Philip a little bit too much attention at dinner, which makes Liz a bit jealous, but they bond later when Liz gives Jackie a tour of the palace. Liz then finds out that Jackie has been slagging off the palace and the monarchy at a dinner party. The truth. The Kennedys visited Buckingham Palace in June 1961. All who were there that night, including JFK himself, described it as a wonderful evening. There was a bit of drama not shown in the series, though. It wasn't really seen as acceptable for divorcees to attend state dinners, and Jackie's sister, Princess Lee Radziwill, was married to her second husband, Polish Prince Stanislaw Albrecht Radziwill. Liz relented and invited them, but refused to invite Princesses Margaret and Marina, who Jackie had specifically requested attend. Later, Jackie described Philip as nice but nervous, and the Queen as heavy-going, and that one felt absolutely no relationship between the couple. Regardless of what Jackie actually said, there are no reports of the news reaching Liz's ears. The following year, on March 28, 1962, Liz and Jackie had a very low-key lunch together where Jackie described Liz to the press as charming. Not sure about the faux pas at dinner, JFK did present the Queen with a silver Tiffany framed signed portrait of himself as a gift with a handwritten message. He wrote Liz a very nice letter afterwards saying thank you for a lovely evening on his return to the US though. Liz goes to Ghana to try and win back Nkrumah to the Commonwealth from the Russians. He greets Liz and takes photos while the Soviet engineers sneak in and work on his Volta Dam. Did Liz charm him with a foxtrot? Yes. Was a white woman dancing with a black man such a big deal? Maybe. Yes, we have to bear in mind that at this time Martin Luther King hadn't even made his I Have a Dream speech yet. They did dance together at a ball in Accra. Despite bombings in the capital, Liz insisted on going on tour to try and smooth things over. She didn't want the Commonwealth to become a white-only club. President Kwame Nkrumah was well on his way to becoming a dictator of the newly independent republic. From the moment her and Philip arrived, they were surrounded by excited crowds. With the goodwill garnered at the ball during her visit, there was no more talk of Ghana leaving the Commonwealth. The Americans were convinced to fund the Volta Dam, cutting off the influence of the Soviets. The dance, taking place at the height of the American Civil Rights Movement, would have raised some eyebrows, I'm sure. In truth, the attachment of Nkrumah to the USSR was never really that extreme. By the time of the ball, African socialism wasn't exactly going to plan. The economy was crumbling, bribes were flying around, political opponents were frequently being jailed. Former mayor of Accra, Nat Nuno Amatifo, remembering the visit from when he was a teenage student, says that to assume the visit tipped the balance away from the Soviets is untrue, and I still don't know why that stupid dance is so important. It barely registered with him and his friends at the time. The Kennedys are having marital problems. Jackie O requests an audience with Liz to smooth things over before their lunch date. Liz hosts her at Windsor Castle to show dominance. As described before, it was a much more low-key affair and it was much more last minute than portrayed. Jackie admits to suffering from postnatal depression, and drug use given by their private physician loosened her tongue, and she apologises for her cruel words. There's no evidence that this conversation happened at their lunch. Obviously, that was a private lunch. Jackie had had a miscarriage and a stillbirth before daughter Caroline was born. Her father was an alcoholic, but John had lots of extramarital affairs as well. Her parents separated in 1936. In 1963, she gave birth to son Patrick, but he died just 2 days later, sending Jackie into a depression. We then see JFK's assassination, his head being blown into Jackie's lap and blood and brains all over her clothes, which she wears for days. Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president, and Liz calls for a week of mourning and bells to be rung for JFK, which was only ever done before for deaths of members of the royal family. It is true that on November the 22nd, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, JFK was shot while riding in an open-top car with Jackie sitting next to him. When later recounting the event to Life magazine, she said, "I could see a piece of his skull coming off. Then he slumped in my lap. His blood and brains were in my lap. I kept saying, 'Jack, Jack, Jack,' and someone was yelling, 'He's dead.' All the ride to the hospital, I kept bending over him, holding the top of his head down, just trying to keep his brains in." She kept on her blood-spattered pink Chanel suit to show them what they've done. She wore it while Johnson was sworn in as president on the plane to Maryland's Bethesda Naval Hospital, where JFK was autopsied, and she only changed out of it when she and JFK's body were returned to the White House around 4 a.m. The maid bagged up her clothes, and months later they were sent to the National Archives, where it's stipulated they are not to be displayed until 100 years after Jackie's death. Until 2103, they'll stay in climate-controlled storage. We now know Jackie suffered with severe PTSD after her 2 stillbirths and her husband's assassination. In the months after JFK's death, Jackie was constantly crying, threatening to take her life, and couldn't sleep due to nightmares and flashbacks. She blamed herself for not having sat in his seat in the car instead. She was drinking heavily, taking large amounts of barbiturates, and conversations with her were difficult as she was prone to angry outbursts. She couldn't look at pictures of JFK. The only photo of him she kept at her house, he had his back turned in it. She was easily startled and jumped when people tried to touch her. Eventually, she did stop drinking and drugs and remarried Aristotle Onassis 3 years later in 1968. To hear about her life before or after the crown, please go and see my Herstory episode on Jackie. I'll put a link in the description box below. Prince Philip attended JFK's funeral to represent Liz, who was pregnant with Edward at the time. In May 1965, the Queen dedicated a memorial to JFK at Runnymede, which Jackie attended. Episode 9. Paterfamilias. Charles is sent to a normal school, but he gets bullied and is very shy. Liz wants to send him to Eton, and Lord Mountbatten takes him to Savile Row to get suits made as a celebration. Philip, however, wants him to go to Gordonstoun in Scotland, where he went. And Philip wins the mental tug of war. Philip flies Charles to school, insists the other boys call him just Charles, signs him up for a grueling endurance test, and the kids are cruel to him and make him sleep in a rain-soaked bed. Charles was educated at Cheam, a prep school in Hampshire, for 5 years before going to Gordonstoun in Scotland, which was a boarding school. He did experience bullying at Gordonstoun, a place he described as, very famously, as Colditz in kilts. A letter home written in 1964 said, "The people in my dormitory are foul. Goodness, they're horrid. I don't know how anybody could be so foul." 10 years later, in a speech launching the Prince's Trust, he said his time at Gordonstoun taught him how to accept challenges and take initiative. Charles was head boy, and he left with 6 O-levels and 2 A-levels in history and French. He then went on to university at Trinity College, Cambridge. Andrew and Edward also went to Gordonstoun. We flash back to Philip's childhood as his sister, who's afraid of flying, flies with him to school. Philip has cold showers, builds walls, and gets bullied, even being pushed out of a window at one point. Gordonstoun strongly denies the wall building and window incidents ever happened. Philip's mother had had a mental breakdown, his dad had run off to Monaco with his mistress, and his sister Cecily has married a Nazi and is expecting a baby. More on Cecily in a tiny bit. Philip's mother, Princess Alice, was born deaf at Windsor Castle in 1885 in the presence of Queen Victoria. In 1930, she did suffer a nervous breakdown and was committed to a sanatorium in Switzerland. She was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic with religious mania after having converted to the Greek Orthodox Church. She claims to be receiving divine messages from both Jesus and Buddha and to have been given healing powers. She would not see her children again until 1938 after Cecily's death. Alice gets her own episode in a later series and will touch more on her then. Philip punches the kid who pushed him out the window and gets punished by being kept at school over half-term to build a wall. This means he can't go to his sister's for the week, and she's obliged to go to a wedding in London instead by plane whilst pregnant. The plane crashes and 12 people died, including Cecily, her husband George, their 2 children Ludwig and Alexander, and the newborn baby. Philip is crushed. He has dreams of walking amongst the wreckage, goes missing in the night, and is found rowing a boat out on the lake. The next day, his train leaves Inverness to Berlin to attend the funeral. Philip walks behind the coffins at the head of the procession to Nazi salutes from the people lining the streets. Princess Alice, his mother, is in attendance and doesn't recognise her own son. His father blames Philip for Cecily being on the flight due to his bad behaviour at school and dresses him down publicly. Back at school, Philip goes out in the night in the rain and builds the wall almost to completion in his grief, finally asking for help to secure the heavy iron gates. He's clearly broken and the other kids rally round him. So firstly, no wall. Royal biographer Hugo Vickers said, "I think the writers used dramatic license to show that Prince Philip threw himself into some kind of physical activity, and that anyone travelling to Gordonstoun to see the Prince Philip wall is in for a disappointment." Secondly, Cecily was attending the wedding in London regardless, so her death being seen by the family or the father as Philip's fault is simply not true and has been called a monstrous lie. One of Philip's school friends from Gordonstoun said, "To use this trauma in Philip's life and fictionalise parts of it, insinuating that it was in any way his fault, is simply outrageous, and there have been calls for the Crown to apologise about this particular episode." So what's true about the crash? On November the 16th, 1937, Princess Cecily, her husband George Donatus, Grand Duke of Hesse, and their kids were flying to London to attend the wedding of George's brother, Louis Donatus. George's mother and the kids' nurse were also on board, as were the pilot and 4 crew members. Due to the fear of flying, Princess Cecily actually went into early labour aboard the plane, but the plane was unable to make a scheduled stop in Brussels due to bad weather, and the pilot had no choice but to keep on flying to Ostend, where a heavy fog descended, limiting the pilot's vision, and the plane clipped a factory chimney. Its wing and engine were torn away from the fuselage, and the plane went down. No one survived the crash. Philip did attend the funeral, of course, and it said he was seen performing the Nazi salute among soldiers. I found a few pictures of Philip at the funeral. I can't find any of him doing the Nazi salute. If you can find them, again, please send them to me on Instagram at the Herstory Girls. Now, just because I can't find photos of it doesn't mean to say it didn't happen. It probably did happen. Philip was 16. This was 2 years before World War II broke out. And Philip's sisters were married to prominent Nazis. So as a 16-year-old boy, he probably just wanted to fit in and feel connected to his sister that he loved the most, that he just lost. So I'm not mad at a hurt kid doing what seemed to be socially acceptable at the time. Looking back, it's easy to judge and criticise, but I think we have to put ourselves in the shoes of a grieving 16-year-old boy here. Cecily was just 26 when she died, and her husband George was only 31 as well. Their other daughter Johanna, who wasn't with them when the plane went down, died only 2 years later of meningitis, aged just 3. Back to Charles. He's running an 18-mile challenge through the woods, rivers and over gates with heavy backpacks. Charles gets left behind quite early on, so a detective goes out to look for him while Philip's waiting anxiously in the presentation hall, seething with disappointment. Charles is hiding in tears as Philip starts the presentation without him, and the detective brings him back to the hall late and dejected. They fly back to Buckingham Palace together, but Charles is scared of flying, while Philip shouts at him to toughen up and not be so bloody weak, ordering him out of the cockpit in tears. Charles would remain at Gordonstoun for a further 5 years. When it came time to send his own sons to school, he sent the boys to Eton. And I think that says everything. And finally, we are on to episode 10, Mystery Man. Now, bear with me because this episode is a little bit jumbled up and all over the place, and I didn't even really understand what was going on, and I'm aware of the perfumer scandal, so stick with me. April 1962. Philip injures his neck in his sleep, and he ends up in a neck brace at an osteopath called Stephen Ward, who says the injury is due to tension and stress. Ward, who coincidentally is an old friend of Mike Parker's, invites Philip to a party. 1 year later, a call girl and spy, Christine Keeler, is interrogated. Does she know Captain Eugenie Ivanov, Soviet naval attaché? Does she know John Profumo, Minister of War? She answers no comment and refuses to identify a mystery man in a photo at Stephen Ward's party. PM Harold Macmillan defends Profumo as not being the mystery man in the photo, the implication being that it therefore must be Prince Philip in the photo for dramatic purposes. Liz is pregnant again with Edward, and her iron levels are very low. Tony is away a lot from Margaret as well, and Margaret's also pregnant too, mirroring Liz's situation with Philip. Margaret definitely thinks the mystery man is Philip. Macmillan resigns over Profumo's scandals, having trusted and defended him, but Liz refuses his resignation because she's taking a leave of absence to Scotland to rest, with the Queen Mother deputising while she's away until the baby is born. Stephen Ward takes his own life after his first day at trial. For what? What charges? I'll tell you in a bit. A hand-drawn portrait of Philip is found among Ward's possessions. Macmillan resigns in 1963 due to ill health. Liz confronts Philip about his infidelity, and the ballerina from episode 1 that we already established preferred the company of women. Philip denies it and says he only cared for Galena. Elizabeth is in labour and Philip watches on as the baby is born, and they christen him Edward. Even though Edward was born on the 10th of March 1964, so that would have been a really long, 2-year pregnancy. Philip was pregnant at Edward's birth, though, as we established earlier. So, I hear you ask, what was the Profumo scandal? And who the dickens are Stephen Ward and Christine Keeler? Christine Keeler was an English model, topless dancer, showgirl, and she became a socialite after she met osteopath Stephen Ward at a dance club, and he drew her into his circle. At age 19, in 1961, she began a sexual relationship with John Profumo, the Secretary of State for War, a married man. This is the problem. She was also involved with Soviet naval attaché Eugenie Ivanov, which created a problem in terms of national security. The affair with Profumo, when it all came out, really heavily discredited Macmillan's Conservative government and was a large factor in the Labour Party, winning the next election in 1964. Keeler described her brief relationship with Profumo as a screw of convenience. As Stephen Ward was also a friend of Ivanov, the Metropolitan Police began investigating him and Keeler in April of 1963. They interviewed 140 of Ward's friends, patients and associates, tapped his phone and watched his home and office 24 hours a day. Keeler kind of caved straight away and admitted her affairs with Profumo and Ivanov. There was none of this no comment business. She caved. Profumo at first denied any knowledge of her whatsoever, but soon told his wife, told the truth and resigned his government position. The News of the World newspaper published The Confessions of Christine, where she told all. However, they painted Ward as her sort of pimp-like figure. Keeler was painted as a prostitute, a tart. Ward was committed for trial on charges of living off the earnings of prostitution and of procuration of a girl under 21, and he was released on bail. This charge is now seen to be really unfair to modern eyes, and Ward is seen as a scapegoat and the trial and the whole circus of that was to deflect from the heat surrounding Profumo and the government. Ward's trial began at the Old Bailey on the 28th of July 1963. The prosecution claimed that contributions towards household expenses that Keeler had made to Ward while they were living together briefly amounted to him living off her prostitution, and they portrayed Ward as the very depths of lechery and depravity. After listening to Judge Marshall's damning summing up, on the evening of the 30th of July, Ward took an overdose of sleeping tablets and was taken to hospital. He was found guilty the next day in absentia. Sentencing was postponed until Ward was fit to appear, but sadly he would never be fit to appear, and 4 days later, on the 3rd of August, he died without ever having regained consciousness. Afterwards, an inquest was launched and a report was published on the 26th of September 1963, which concluded that there had been no security leaks in the Profumo affair. Profumo had been guilty of an indiscretion only. Most of the blame was laid on the now dead Stephen Ward, who was not in a position to defend himself. He was called an utterly immoral man whose diplomatic activities were misconceived and misdirected. Macmillan resigned soon after on the grounds of ill health. After expressing his deep remorse to the Prime Minister, Profumo disappeared from public view. After 2 brief marriages and 2 children, who were largely raised by her mother Julie, Keeler largely lived alone from the mid-90s until her death in December 2017. She published several inconsistent accounts of her life and numerous affairs, in which she always refused to implicate Ward in any way as anything less than a gentleman. Her portrait by Ward can be seen in the National Portrait Gallery. In January 2014, Stephen Ward's case and trial were referred to the Criminal Cases Review Commission as a historical injustice. They unfortunately chose not to overturn his conviction, as the original transcript of the judge's summing up had been lost. Ivanov disappeared after the scandal, popping up again in 1992 when his memoirs, The Naked Spy, were published in the Sunday Times. Philip's involvement was vehemently denied by all, including the press, who backed him to the hilt on this one. Though that doesn't mean he was always faithful. Allegedly. And we'll talk about that more in season 3. So there we have it. What did I think? Well, season 1 was pretty accurate. It was pretty close to the truth. Season 2 is where things start to divert somewhat, and I understand it's very difficult when you're working with things where you simply don't know. You simply don't know what happened in private conversations. You don't know what happened on the yacht in Lisbon between Liz and Phil. You don't know what happened when JFK and Jackie O visited Buckingham Palace. You don't know what happened in the alleged extramarital affairs of Prince Philip. You just don't know. But the one thing we do know is a lie, is that Philip was in any way responsible or could be found at fault for the death of his sister, Princess Cecily. I do have to agree that that is not a nice thing for him and his family to have had to see. And I understand why they did it as a dramatic plot point, but I do think they should issue an apology on that. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Am I being too soft, or do you think that was a slight step too far? I think he could have been sad enough about his sister's death, built the wall, done the run, put himself through his physical paces without, and he could have felt guilty as well, without being blamed for it, and without having his father dress him down at the funeral and stuff like that, when that just simply didn't happen. No one ever felt he was responsible at all. She was going to the wedding in London regardless of what was going on at Gordonstoun. So yeah, let me know in the comments below what you think. Do you think the Crown should apologise over that? Or do you think that now Prince Philip is gone, it should just be left as is? I'm interested to hear what you have to think. Thank you for joining me for Historian Reacts to season 2 of The Crown, and I look forward to seeing you again for season 3, which will be coming very, very soon. If you haven't already, please subscribe